Greetings, Jessica. Greetings, Larry. Thank you both for being here. I want to start with just some stats, just to make it fast, because so you guys don't have to bring them up, because this is so central. Okay, 5 million American households can't get in broadband because they just don't have any way to do it. 20 million American households can't afford it. So that's 25 million American households who can't connect to the internet. Meanwhile, 30% of American children don't have the connection needed for education at a time when half the country is saying, or 3/4 of the country, kids are going to have to go to school online at least part of the time. And as Larry pointed out to me, he was estimating that for Blacks and Latinos, it's probably closer to 50% of kids. One final stat, and this all came from Larry, by the way, 27% of American seniors don't have internet. And that's at a time when we're saying, hey, healthcare is going virtual. So, Jessica, let me start with you. How bad is that?
I think it's terrible. Shame on the United States. This infrastructure is as essential as water and electricity. If you don't have internet access in your home, you don't have a fair shot at 21st century education, healthcare, economic opportunity, all of it. And it needs to become a national imperative to get everyone online. And it's especially chilling to me right now that there are so many kids who fall into this homework gap, who are locked out of the digital classroom. And with this pandemic still raging and schools still closing, we have got to figure out how to address that homework gap. It's essential for the future of our children, our communities, and really our country.
That's a great term, by the way. You've been an advocate for this for a long time, Jessica. But what I'm curious to hear you talk about quickly before we bring Larry in is, one of the things that's come up a couple times already today in our discussions is that the COVID pandemic has helped people understand some things about connectivity that they may not have realized. I mean, I think people like us, the techonomists, you two, techonomy community generally have known, hey, without wireless, without connectivity, the economy is basically dead. But now everybody's finally realizing that. Do you think, given that this connectivity issue has not moved forward at the pace that it should have politically and policy-wise, that maybe a broader constituency will emerge to push this forward faster?
Yeah, let me be a raging and impatient optimist and say yes. Because heading into this crisis, a lot of folks in Washington treated broadband as nice to have, not need to have. But as a nation, we're now online. And the communities that don't have access and the households that don't have access obviously need it. And I think that there is a conversion in Washington and a broader recognition like the one you're describing.
Well, that would be great to hear, great to witness. Larry, you've been, like Jessica, an activist on this for a long time. You've been in the White House. You've done a lot of work in policy across many, many arenas. Right now, you work a lot in cybersecurity, but you do a lot of entrepreneurial related stuff. But give us your big picture view about this problem. I did steal all your stats just to make things go more efficiently here, but tell us how we ought to be thinking about this problem from your perspective.
You ought to be thinking about it that there's no way this country can realize all of what we're trying to realize if everybody's not connected. Let me give you another statistic that I didn't give you. I'm from Queens, New York. Richest city in the history of the world is New York City. 40% of small businesses in New York City don't have access to a gig network. A network that every other business has access to. And that's 80 to 90% of Black and brown businesses in the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn can't access a gig network. How can you possibly run a business if you can't get access to the network that every other business in America is on? Those are the ways we should be thinking about it. That we're in a global race. There's 360 million Americans. The rest of the world is connected. The rest of the world is suffering through this pandemic. If we want to cure our seniors, if we want to educate our youth, if we want to run businesses, if you want to understand the political equation, you have to be online, and you cannot be online. And the statistics I gave you and that you gave us, they were all pre-pandemic. As these supplements run out, as the PPP money runs out, we're going to not be looking at 20 million people can't afford it, 20 million households, we'll get 25 million households at a time when we're trying to build America back. So one of the things I'm trying to explain to my friends in the Biden campaign is This has got to be a central part of the Build Back Better equation, that we're not going to build back better if we look at, as my good friend Jessica Rosenworcel said, and I am a huge fan of hers for the work she's doing, but if we don't look at this as an essential tool, as just maybe a nice to have tool, there's no way America comes back to where it was pre-pandemic and exceeds where we were.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned Biden, because I was just reading something, I think in the paper today, a statement he made about infrastructure, and he was talking about ports and roads, and he didn't say networks. That to me is very worrisome. You know, are they going to get it? This is so central. I mean, this is the most economic point that could be made. If all the other stuff is going to flow from everyone being included digitally, because we live in a digital society.
Well, I'll start, but you know, I've had the great benefit, the honor of serving on 2 presidential transition teams. I was on the Obama-Biden, I was on the Clinton-Gore. Most of what I did on Obama-Biden, I just called Jessica and said, what should we do? And it worked out pretty well for us. The BTOP program, lots of other things came out of that. I believe there are some smart people around the president. I know many of the vice president. I know many of them. I'm a partisan. I'm hoping he wins. But I think if he wins, he will understand, because the people around him do understand. I've worked with Ron Klain. I've worked with Larry Strickland. I've worked with a lot of the close advisors of him. They get this, he gets this. There is no way you can do what America needs to be done without making investment in infrastructure. And one thing he did say, he said $20 billion for rural broadband, and that's important. But it is as important that we invest in our cities, and we invest in our schools, and we invest in our libraries, we invest in these hubs. You know, Cincinnati is as important as Des Moines, as important as Cut and Shoot, Texas, and all of them need investment, and all of them need upgrade. These digital deserts, as some like to call it, these gigabit deserts, they exist in every city. Unfortunately, they exist in every city where people are poor, where people are brown, where people are black, where people are immigrants. We've got to do better than that.
Yeah, that is well said. Jessica, what is the best tool we have to move most quickly from here?
That's a really good question. You know, with all respect to techonomy, I think we can't be technocratic about this. I think you got to move some hearts and minds. And in the next few weeks, schools across this country are going to decide just how viable it is for students to head back into physical buildings, and whether or not they have to continue with online learning. Already we've seen lots of school districts say that kids are still going to be in a digital classroom. And I think in the next several weeks, we have an opportunity to use that fact to get Congress and the FCC to pay attention to the homework gap like never before. Because we've got to take what's happening in the world around us to convert all of this energy into action. And the place to start is with our kids. And by the way, this is a problem in rural America and urban America. It affects red America and blue America. We've got to connect every child. And I think because this problem actually unites us, there's some possibility that we will get there. I would have liked us to have done this years ago, but I will settle with the fact that there's more energy to get this done now in Washington than I've ever seen before.
And David,
go ahead, Larry, sorry.
And it's not just in Washington. I was on the phone with, I'm a New Yorker, and I was on the phone with some folks from New York State, and we were talking about one of the possible solutions, and I stole this again because I shamelessly steal from Jessica every chance I get. Every public school, every library, every public institution across the country should have a gig pipe going into it. And at least in the near term, the E-rate and other federal funds should say, you have a gig pipe coming in that school. We are in libraries. We already have kids in parking lots doing their homework to steal the Wi-Fi from the library. Why don't we just stick a tower and use EBS or CBRS, the radio spectrum, to let anybody in the community? I went to PS 118 in Jamaica, Queens. 43% of the kids in my community today do not have access to broadband at their home. 43%. But PS 118 is within a mile or 2 miles of almost every kid in that school. That school has a gig network. If I threw a wireless tower on top of that school for almost no additional cost, $8,000, $10,000, I could connect that entire community to a network that would give those kids the kind of connectivity they have. Those kinds of thoughtful approaches can happen, should happen, will happen, with Jessica at helping us make it happen.
Thanks.
And there's another one I just want to throw out there, which is we've got wireless hotspots in lots of libraries nationwide. They loan them out to people who don't have connectivity. We should have hotspots for loan in every school library in the United States. We could solve so much of the homework gap overnight if we just decided that was necessary infrastructure for our school, just like textbooks.
But Jessica, tell us what E-rate is, which Larry mentioned, and how that might be applied here to sort of bring some of the funding for that.
Yeah, E-rate, and I bet you Larry was around because I learned all these things from him over time. When it came about, it was part of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. I mean, 1996 was like hiss and ding, you know, dial-up modem. It was a long time ago, right? But Congress was ahead of the curve. Congress saw this, that we should get the internet in all of our nation's schools. So it created the E-rate program in the Telecommunications Act of 1996. It is now the nation's largest education technology program. And it's run by the FCC, and it supports schools in every state with their connectivity to the internet in the physical building. We've got to recognize that the classroom is no longer in that physical building, and we need to use that funding to help students get connected at home. We can do that with the law today. I am working very hard to convince my colleagues, and I'm pretty relentless. I haven't convinced them, but I want them to think about the programs we have in the law now and reshape them to meet this moment. We've got a pandemic, but we've got tools to help address the homework gap, and we should use them.
Wow.
Dave,
So
before we move on,
Yeah.
you know, leadership matters. In 1993, Bill Clinton said we're going to connect every school, every library, every hospital, every rural health clinic to the internet. We called it the information superhighway. 1995, 25 years ago this month, the first report showing the information have and have not, I helped produce it on behalf of President Clinton and Vice President Gore. Vice President Gore and President Clinton are the ones who really came up with the idea of the E-rate. And what's important to know is in 1995-96, when we said we should have an E-rate to connect public schools and public libraries and other institutions, there was huge political opposition. But the president said, I will not sign a telecom act that doesn't take care of schools, libraries, health clinics, and hospitals. That's where leadership matters. We need that kind of visionary, focused leadership going forward. And the advantage of being old is I actually saw that and was part of it. But the other advantage of being old is I know that when leaders step up, say, this is something that matters to me, put their political life on the line, great things can happen. And the E-rate is a great thing because every kid in America now knows what the internet is. In 1995, just 25 years ago, far too many kids didn't.
Well, I certainly hope it becomes part of the next stimulus package, although I'd recommend not reminding anybody that it came out of Clinton Gore. Just act like it came out of the sky, and then it's more likely to happen.
That's exactly right.
But Josh, we have some really great questions I've seen. I don't know if Catherine Steiner Adair is able to get on audio, but could we try to make that happen?
Catherine, I'm going to allow you to talk. If you want to make your comment, you should be able to turn on your mic now.
Okay. Can you hear me, David?
Yeah, there you go. Good.
So to your points, I am a educator and a psychologist. I do a lot of work with schools around the country. I'm in Maine right now trying to do webinars that over 4,000 teachers and parents in different capacities have signed up for. And the internet is so poor at my house that I have to drive to another community. I actually did one for the Association of New England Schools that had to get canceled because Spectrum will not invest in my dirt road community because there are only 30 families here. We are elderly, we are infants, we are completely dependent on technology, and we are completely inadequately served. So here I am trying to work on how to teach teachers how to do better distance learning, because that's something I happen to know a lot about, how to combine social emotional learning, diversity, anti-racism for the first 3 weeks of school, to rebuild community, to deal with this trauma, how to hold trauma, and I can't get online.
Wow.
Yeah.
Any comments?
Well, two. One, Olympia Snowe, the former senator from Maine, Republican. There was no member of Congress that I worked more close with when I was in government than Olympia Snowe. And the E-rate and lots of things around it, she understood because she's from Maine what was needed. Same thing, Pat Leahy's from Vermont, folks from those rural communities. Second point is, as you know, David, as Jessica knows, I had to drive an hour today from where I'm staying in, an hour from DC. I'm staying in a rural town in Virginia, and I had to drive to a hotel because they don't have internet connectivity.
Thank you for doing that, buddy.
I'm seeing kids driving into a library parking lot to do homework. This makes no sense. The rural issue with the FCC, to their credit, is going to spend $20 billion over the next 18 months, I think it is, to try to do some increased connectivity and broadband infrastructure in rural America. It is desperately needed. And one of the things we've got to do is we've got to get out of these silos of red and blue and urban and rural. Every American should want every American to have access to what every American needs. And I will do anything I can to help get rural America connected because it matters.
Well, one of the things that Techonomy has actually found, for whatever you might want to say about the Trump administration, there are aspects of this they really understand. Michael Kratsios understands a lot of this stuff. I think Jared Kushner understands a lot of this stuff. If we could just somehow get together. I find that very frustrating. Josh, there's somebody, Rob Colarino.
Let me quickly go to Gary, and then we'll move on from there. Gary, you should be able to unmute. Yep, there you are.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So Larry and Jessica, back in 2008, I was the co-founder of something called the U.S. Broadband Coalition, and we brought together 137 organizations to craft this national strategy for the country. So, and the good news is it was just an amazing amount of energy. And the bad news is that the FCC watered down so much of our work, and we're gratified that things like VTOP happened, but the truth is that there was a really great groundswell of energy that the sausage making machine inside the Beltway just dissipated. So what makes this the moonshot that it needs to be? How do we get a national broadband strategy that has teeth in it? And how do we just basically wave a magic wand that gets this technology so widely distributed that we just don't even question it? We don't even question it that every single person in the country should have gigabit access to the internet.
Do you want to start, Jessica, or?
Sure, no problem. And by the way, I co-sign everything Larry said up to this point too. So here's the thing. As a nation, we need to set an audacious goal. We need to say that we want gigabit speeds for everyone. We want 100 megabits for everyone within the next 2 years. We want everyone to be able to legitimately have access to 5G technology. When you set an audacious goal, you build policies toward it. And I really think it's important in Washington at the executive level and the congressional level to itemize those goals with perfect clarity, because then we will organize every subsequent policy activity around it and we will fund it properly.
Hey, Jessica, I have a question for you to follow up on that. I'm in a rural area right now also. I recently upgraded with Optimum, which is basically Cablevision. And now my monthly cable bill, which is almost entirely for my internet, is $210 a month, right? And I supposedly upgraded to a much higher bandwidth. However, the performance has been essentially invisibly different, right? Is there any prospect we could get regulation that would basically ensure that when somebody's charging me $60 more a month than they were charging me before, I can actually get what I'm paying for?
Yeah, we absolutely need to do more to make sure that consumers get what they pay for. A lot of state attorneys general have actually started looking into this issue, but we have so little transparency into what we're paying for in every environment. And connectivity is complicated. It's not just you to the wall, it's a whole network of activity behind it. But I do think we have got to fundamentally come up with a way that every consumer feels like it's not a black box. They know what they're paying for and they actually get it.
Well, I could understand, yeah, the neighborhood might all be on Zooms and maybe they just can't give me that broadband the degree.
Yeah.
But if that's the case, then they should vary my fee. They should not be charging me for something I'm not getting. Anyway.
So one of the challenges also is you're probably, like a lot of people, using some Wi-Fi. And most of our unlicensed activity right now takes place, it's a little nerd alert, on the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz bands. And as we multiply devices in our houses and use this unlicensed spectrum and Wi-Fi access and we move to the Internet of Things, a lot of those unlicensed airwaves are growing crowded. And so what happens is we can often have an awfully fast internet experience that gets off on the wireless equivalent of a gravel road.
Right.
And over time, we're going to have to add more and more of our nation's spectrum resources to unlicensed. So that doesn't happen with all of our Wi-Fi connections, especially as we move to the Internet of Things.
Yeah, like people might have a Nest camera and they don't even realize how much bandwidth that's taking just to be operating. Josh, do we have another question that we can go to?
Yep, we're going to go to Rob Clarina. Let's see. Rob, you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me, David?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for what you guys are doing. I dropped a question in the box there to expand upon a little bit. It was on creativity and its potential loss from COVID recovery. It seems like there could be lessons learned here from the emerging markets overseas because, they went from sort of landlines to, to mobile pretty quickly. So this is less technology, but in as much about education and family values and, some of the basics to allow people to dream and how to go about achieving certain dreams. So Jessica and Larry, I welcome your input, please.
A couple of things. We saw I was one of those people who in the 2010, 2012 was a huge believer that mobile devices were going to cure the digital divide and that we had gone from kind of a laptop world to a mobile world and that would be enough. We saw that in Africa, we saw that in Japan, we saw that in lots of places. Some places just never went to kind of traditional internet. I've increasingly come to understand that you can't have mobile without gig, you can't have gig without fiber, you can't have what we want without making sure that the basic infrastructure is there. We all, wherever you are using your internet, you're using as much Wi-Fi now as you are anything else, but all of that Wi-Fi goes back to a fiber cable. So if we don't do the basics, we don't do the blocking and tackling, that's not going to happen. But to your larger point, we have a lot of societal problems right now. And one of the things I learned in the 90s when we were first connecting schools and hospitals and libraries and community technology centers and police cars and fire trucks, my little agency did all of that from 93 to 99. And one of the things we learned is that problems are solved closest to the problem. If I want to solve a rural problem, let me talk to people in that rural community. If I want to solve an urban problem, solve an immigrant problem, let's talk to people in those communities. The internet is a wonderful thing. This technology is great. We have to give people the access and the tools to make it greater. So Rob, I'm with you. The more we can disperse this, the more we can give people access, the greater the creativity. But that creativity only happens if people have access to broadband networks, and that requires an investment in fiber that we have to make ubiquitously.
We're getting tons of great questions. I want to throw one at Jessica from Michael Miller, who is a true, genuine expert at all matters technological and consumer, particularly as a longtime editor of PC Magazine. He wants to know why internet connectivity is so much more expensive in the US than in other countries.
I think that the primary reason in the United States is we don't have adequate competition. Competition increases innovation and it lowers prices. And for most of our households, they've only got one provider. I know, I'm an FCC commissioner. There's only one provider that can actually bring anything north of 100 megabits to my house. And I think as a nation, this is hard. We've got densely populated areas. We've got very rural areas. Competition flourishes more likely in the more populated areas. And I think in the near future, there is some hope that technology is going to bring more substitution and more competition. You can imagine a future with fixed wireless and 5G being a reasonable competitor to the DOCSIS infrastructure that most people get their cable-based broadband over today. There are possibilities in the future with extraordinary low Earth orbiting satellites for increasing competition, particularly in our rural areas. So I think that there's a future out there that gets more competitive, but it's not satisfying in the short term because Americans do pay more. And that has consequences because this is an input to our creativity, our civic life, our commercial life, our economy.
Great, great. And I'm so glad you mentioned 5G, which we've talked a lot about in the last 4 days here at Techonomy at this event. Jim McCann, who is chairman of Techonomy, is, I believe, ready to ask a question. Jim.
First a comment and then a question. David, I think you've done a terrific job of highlighting, for me at least, the idea that broadband access at an affordable rate is essential to so many things. Just in the last few days, I've heard you, and including today, you've talked about how it's essential for healthcare. We heard from Dr. Grossman yesterday how everything in healthcare is improving if there's data and science behind it, access, and how 5G will help there. It's essential to business, as Larry Irving just mentioned in terms of my hometown, Queens, New York, that 40% of businesses don't have access to a broad pipe. That's quite amazing. We heard from Mr. Banks yesterday that 2/3 of all the people who live in public housing don't even have access to the internet, never mind an appropriate device. So if it's essential there, I turn around and ask the commissioner, how do we, as you were just talking about in terms of competition, when you hear people like Facebook who are doing things with balloons in Africa to provide access because it's valuable to them, how do we turn the profit incentive to companies who have the capital and the motivation to bring more people onto the internet? How do we make it economic for them to deploy their capital and their brain power to make it more accessible?
And that's a question coming from the CEO of a large public company, by the way. So go ahead. Former CEO.
I think as technology evolves, we're going to see more opportunities to do that. Already, we've got providers using millimeter spectrum, like in the 37 and 39 gigahertz band, to offer competitive broadband alternatives in dense urban areas. Like I said, we're going to see new satellite constellations, and I think 5G itself will be a reasonable competitor to a lot of the cable-based broadband we know today. I know that's not satisfying because I too want to see more competition, but most of the tools that the FCC had to increase competition from the Telecommunications Act of 1996 have been whittled away by our courts. And I don't sense a new appetite in Congress to revisit the fundamentals of that law, but I do sense a lot of possibility as technology develops.
We're going to wrap momentarily, but somebody has asked us to ask a question for him. Abdullah Al-Najem, if I got that right, asked, what is the mental health ramifications for all these people who have no or very poor internet connectivity? They must be really, really scarily bad. I added that editorializing, but it's a great question.
Well, let me tell you, this last week I haven't had internet access, and it's been bad for my personal mental health. But I will. But in more seriousness, imagine that you're an elderly person. My mom is 90 years old. I've seen her once. She's been able to at least stay in touch with her grandchildren, her great grandchildren, and her children via FaceTime because she has that access. Imagine that you're living in a housing project, you're living in assisted living, you're living wherever, and you can't touch people physically, and you can't see them. Imagine that you're a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, and for years, you can never make up what a child's learning at 6, 7, or 8 when they're 12 or 13 or 14, and yet we're gonna put a third or maybe 40% of our kids in a situation this fall where they can't learn this fall because they, like other kids are learning, because they don't have access to the right tools. What does it mean to somebody when you can't do? Jessica and I have a very good friend who's a former commissioner of the FCC. He tells a story about how he had COVID early and he did telehealth with his doctor, and his doctor said, looking at him, you need to get to a hospital. What happens to the person who can't do telehealth with their doctor because they don't have access to it? It's mental health, it's educational health, it's physical health. It is everything you can conceive of. We can do some amazing things unless we can't. And for far too many of our fellow Americans, we can't. And the reality is, we're losing hundreds of billions of dollars of economic opportunity. We're losing millions of lives. And the investment we'd have to make to offset the billions of dollars we're losing is relatively small.
The thing that we have to wrap, but the thing that I was just thinking about is all of us on this Zoom realize that without internet connectivity, we basically couldn't do 95% of the things we do, period, in every area. Our shopping, our entertainment, it's all this stuff, our healthcare, what little education we're getting at this age. And the idea that there's so many Americans and people all over the world, as Heather Johnson from Ericsson mentioned earlier, is just as urgently problematic. But in our own country, with all of our supposed wealth, that such a large number of people are left out of this. It's like they're living in a different century. This is not a minor matter.
No, it was about a century ago that only people who lived in cities could turn the lights on. Our farms didn't know from electrification. But as a nation, we did something. We decided we would pass the Rural Electrification Act, and we would map where service was and wasn't, and we would spend until we got everyone connected, because we thought it would improve their lives and grow our economy. We need that same audacity here. We need to be clear as day in Washington. That's our goal, because I think policies and funding will follow. And it's definitely time to do that. I would start with kids and online learning in the next few weeks, because closing the homework gap, I think, is the launch pad for this effort.
I hope the next stimulus gives some money to E-rate. I've got to say, thank you both so much. That was really great.